Race and politics. When I say race and politics, what I'm referring to is the early civil rights movement, specifically the African American early civil rights movement. Generally, when we refer to the African American civil rights movement, we were talking about the 1950s or the 1960s. But this movement took place much earlier in the early 1900s. And it took place in response to the discrimination and the poverty that was going on in the South during that time period. The conditions of blacks in the South after Reconstruction had really continued on from Reconstruction. First of all, violence. There was still lynching going on. I'll give you a sense of what I mean by lynching. In the source called Lynch Law in America, it was written by Ida B. Wells, who was an activist and a writer at the time. We will talk about her a little bit later as well. But she describes lynching. She states, Sam Holt was burned at the stake in a public road before the torch was applied to the pyre. The Negro was deprived of his ears, fingers, and other portions of his body. Before the body was cool, it was cut to pieces. The bones were crushed into small bits, and even the tree upon which the wretch met his fate were torn up and disposed of as souvenirs. The Negro's heart was cut in small pieces, as was also his liver. Those unable to obtain the ghastly relics directly paid more fortunate possessors extravagant sums for them. Small pieces of bone went for 25 cents and a bit of liver, crisply cooked for 10 cents. And it sounds pretty gruesome, and it was. Just to give you a sense of how widespread lynching was, let's take a look at this source. This source is called Lynching from the Negro's Point of View. It was written by Mary Church Terrell, which, like Ida B. Wells, she was an activist and a writer. She states, before 1904 was 3 months old, 31 Negroes had been lynched. Of this number, 15 were murdered within 1 week in Arkansas, and 1 was shot to death in Springfield, Ohio, by a mob composed of men who did not take the trouble to wear masks. So in other words, these were not necessarily KKK members. Hanging, shooting, and burning black men, women, and children in the United States have become so common that such occurrences create but little sensation and evoke but slight comment now. Those who are jealous of their country's fair name feel keenly the necessity of extirpating this lawlessness, which is so widespread and has taken such a deep root, but means of prevention can never be devised until the cause of lynching is more generally understood. Other conditions in the South that continued from Reconstruction was poverty. The poverty took place in part because of the sharecropping labor system that was in place. We talked about this during Reconstruction. That oftentimes African Americans couldn't get a fair shake. They couldn't earn a sufficient living, an independent living, which is what they wanted during Reconstruction. There's inequality, thanks in part to the Jim Crow laws. Again, the Jim Crow laws were about segregation. I want to be clear on this because I don't want anybody to be confused about the Jim Crow laws. It was about segregation, not necessarily separate but equal, meaning separate train cars, separate schools, etc. What Plessy versus Ferguson did in 1896 was it solidified those Jim Crow laws, that it established separate but equal. And these laws will continue from the 1890s to the 1950s. Other conditions post-Reconstruction were literacy tests, where black men were denied suffrage. In other words, you had to be literate to be able to vote, which many were former slaves or were the children of former slaves and were not raised with an education. So this denied them political power. Also, poll tests. Black men were also denied suffrage or voting rights because they had to pay a poll tax to be able to vote. And if you're poor, you're not going to have the money to do that. The early civil rights movement had many leaders, but the ones I want to highlight in this lecture are Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. Booker T. Washington was an educator. He was the founder of the Tuskegee University, which promoted vocational and industrial education, and he was a former slave. Booker T. Washington's strategy was that African Americans should get vocational or industrial education, that was key in fighting poverty, in fighting discrimination, to uplifting African Americans. He believed that you had to start on the lowest rung of society and work your way up and become self-sufficient. And if you did that, then you would show white society that you are capable, that you are productive members of society, and then gradually you would be accepted. He did not believe in an abrupt change, and he didn't believe that African Americans should necessarily have academic education or ask for political rights. That vocational and industrial education was the way to go. To give you a sense of what he said, let's go to one of his speeches or his addresses. It's the Atlanta Exposition Address in 1895. And in this address, he will say, in all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So what he's saying there is that we don't necessarily need full political and civil rights, that we can work together. And working together with whites will make a good society. He also was trying to encourage northern industrialists to hire African Americans because they had these vocational skills. Because this is the time of U.S. industrialization, a number of immigrants are being hired by these industrialists, and he's trying to get them to hire African Americans. Another point that I want to point out in his address is this one. He makes it sort of a metaphor in a way. He says, a ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal, water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel at once came back, cast your bucket down where you are. A second time, the signal, water, water, send us water, ran up for the distressed vessel, was answered, cast down your bucket where you are. And a third and fourth signal for water was answered, cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel, at last heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh, sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. To those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man, who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. So he's basically saying, start where you are. Start on the rung of society that you are. Next is W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was a scholar, professor. He was freeborn. He was the co-founder of the Niagara Movement, which opposed segregation and discrimination. He was also the co-founder of the NAACP. Du Bois's strategy to combat discrimination and poverty amongst African Americans in the South was opposite of Booker T. Washington's strategy. Whereas Washington believed in industrial education, he believed in academic education. Whereas Washington believed that African Americans didn't need to be involved in politics, Du Bois believed they did need to be involved in politics. Du Bois believed there should be an abrupt change, whereas Washington believed the change would be gradual. So let's take a look at a few of Du Bois's speeches. Let's look at the first one. It's called the Niagara Movement's Address to the Country. And in this speech, he really outlines his strategy. First, he says, we want full manhood suffrage, and we want it now, henceforth, and forever. Second, we want discrimination in public accommodation to cease. Separation in railway and streetcars based on simply on race and color is un-American, undemocratic, and silly. We protest against all such discrimination. Third, we claim the right of freedmen to walk, talk, and be with them that wish to be with us. No man has a right to choose another man's friends, and to attempt to do so is an impudent interference with the most fundamental human privilege. He will go on to say other things as well. So let's take a look at his other speech. The Talented Tenth. In this speech, he is calling on young college-educated black men. He calls them the talented tenth, and that they should be advocating for political actions and fighting for civil rights for African Americans. But in this speech, he also criticizes Booker T. Washington. He calls him a good man, but he says that his strategy is flawed. I just want to point out a few places where he makes that point. He says, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South. This policy has been courageously and insistently advocated for over 15 years, and has been triumphant for perhaps 10 years. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, what has been the return in these years there have occurred? The disenfranchisement of the Negro, the legal creation of distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, the steady withdrawal of aid from institution for the higher training of the Negro. So in other words, he said that you've had this industrial education idea for a number of years, and it hasn't resulted in anything positive for the African American. He will go on to say the complete incorrectness of Washington's approach. He says that here in the last paragraph. It says it would be unjust to Mr. Washington not to acknowledge that in several instances he has opposed movements in the South which were unjust to the Negro. He sent memorials to the Louisiana and Alabama constitutional conventions. He has spoken against lynching, and in other ways has openly or silently set his influence against sinister schemes and unfortunate happenings. So he's complimenting on speaking out against violence against African Americans. But then he goes on to say this: notwithstanding this, it is equally true to assert that on the whole, the distinct impression left by Mr. Washington's propaganda is first, that the South is justified in its present attitude toward the Negro because of the Negro's degradation. Secondly, that the prime cause of the Negro's failure to rise more quickly is his wrong education in the past. And thirdly, that his future rise depends primarily on his own efforts. Each of these propositions is a dangerous half truth. The supplementary truths must never be lost sight of. First, slavery and race prejudice are potent, if not sufficient, causes of the Negro's position. Second, industrial and common school training were necessarily slow in planting because they had to await the black teachers trained by higher educations, it being extremely doubtful if any essentially different development was possible, and certainly a Tuskegee was unthinkable before 1880. And third, while it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive mightily to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success. So, in other words, Washington is relying too much of the efforts of white society to help African Americans out of poverty and to correct discrimination. And finally, Ida B. Wells. Wells was an investigative journalist. She was born into slavery, but she did not grow up in slavery. She was an educator. She was a co-founder of the NAACP, and she was a women's suffrage activist. Ida B. Wells' strategy is a little bit in between Washington's strategy and Du Bois' strategy. So she was kind of in the middle between the two. She saw the value in both. Okay, that concludes this lecture. I will post those links to the sources that we went over in this lecture. I want you to pay particular attention to the strategies of Washington and Du Bois and the associated sources that I provided you.